Hello, museum friends, and welcome to another Museum from Home talk. I'm Nat, and today we're going to talk about the life of Joseph Israel Lobdell. So, who was he? Joseph Israel Lobdell was a trans man who lived during the late 1800s and early 1900s. And the reason why we're putting a spotlight him on today gets to some of the main reasons why we study history. To understand how we've changed as a culture, and in some ways, why we still may be the same. So, often we discuss major figures in history for their bold accomplishments. We tell their stories because they did great things. They pushed boundaries and made change, and in some ways, we might connect to them on a personal level. We write shelves of biographies to understand where they came from and how it informed who they became and what they accomplished. And I'm not saying there isn't any value to these stories, but I'd argue the real meat of history is reading and understanding the lives of everyday people, because we get to know how they lived. Most of us aren't going to be Alexander Hamiltons or Taylor Swifts, sorry. Many of us are just people trying to live and hopefully live well. And more importantly, stories of everyday people help us understand and empathize in what ways life was like for certain groups of people, how it has improved, or in what ways it has remained the same, and maybe still needs to change. The memoirs, diaries, and accounts of everyday people are the ones we should cherish and read because they could have easily been us during a different time. These people are who we could have been. So Joseph Israel Lobdell was actually born Lucy Ann Lobdell on December 2nd, 1829. This date marked the beginning of something special for her parents, Sarah and James. Their prayers to have a family were finally answered, and Lucy became the first of their children to survive past infancy. And for that, she wrote in her memoir that her parents likely spoiled her just a little too much. At least until more children came along, and attention had to be divided amongst a fuller house. Now I'm going to pause for a moment to address pronouns. While I'm referring to Lucy as she thought of herself as Lucy, I'm going to use the pronoun she. But when Lucy transitions to Joseph and starts thinking of himself as he, him, I will transition to the he, him pronoun. So anyway, moving on. Early on, Lucy seemed ready to stand out amongst her siblings. At just 10 years old, she declared to her father a desire to attend school. And at this particular time in history, school was an added expense for a middle-class family, and one certainly not afforded to girls. But James Lobdell actually said yes to the request, so long as Lucy could pay her way. So she began learning how to protect livestock and wield a gun. Throughout her adolescence, she engaged in things that weren't seen as suitable for a young woman, becoming educated, shooting, trapping, tramping around in the wilderness. She became a bit of a local curiosity and built a lot of lore for herself. It's important to note here that these ideals come from something referred to by historians as the cult of domesticity, or the cult of true womanhood. It was a value system for the upper and middle class to follow that dictated women were in charge of the home and family, while men were in charge of all things public. It set down rules that women should be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic. When women were married, they were expected to be subservient to their husbands. Lucy, at one point in her memoir, actually compared marriage at the time to that of chattel slavery, a life of unending work for a master that showed no appreciation for her efforts. This memoir of hers was written after her first marriage, which we'll get to in a moment. In Lucy's adolescence, she did fancy a man named George Slater. They hung out with one another and seemed to share a little teenage romance. Her father didn't quite approve, and of course that only made her desire George more. So her father eventually forbade Lucy from seeing him. But when Lucy found out George had fallen ill, Lucy decided to steal her brother's clothes and ride off into the night to check on him. She likely felt a sense of freedom in this moment. After she finds George in the care of a doctor, she writes that upon coming home to look in the mirror, she, quote, learned how much an adventure added health and beauty to the cheek, unquote. There is an excitement here that is one of many pivotal moments in Lucy realizing her identity. After this night ride, there's a change in Lucy. She no longer carries the same kind of affections for George. When she goes off to school and her family also moves away to present-day Delaware County, she is relieved that it will be a natural end to her and George. But he actually follows the family from all the way up in Albany County to down here in Delaware County and proposes marriage to Lucy, who reluctantly accepts after seeming to feel pressure from her family and friends. The marriage lasted probably less than 2 years. It ended with Lucy taking her daughter Helen to live with her parents, feeling fearful of living with George at that point. After George and Lucy separated, she was penniless and made the difficult decision to leave her daughter in the care of her parents and strike out on her own to make a life and a fortune. But not as Lucy. In 1854, at the age of 25, Lucy Ann Lobdell walked into the woods of Delaware County in Long Eddy and re-emerged as Joseph Israel Lobdell. However, at this time, Lucy writes in her memoir that she went out dressed as a man to find better work and pay. He migrated to a new town to make his fortune and a new life just across the border in Pennsylvania as a music teacher. Joe had always been quite an adept singer and violinist during his youth. When he would venture out into the woods, it's said that as the sun began to set, people would sit out on their porch in expectation of hearing Joe singing as he came home. Joe turned heads in this new town, particularly of the young female students who became quite fond of him. And Joe discovered he liked their affections and actually returned the flirtations of one woman. Joe at some point realized himself as living as a man, not as a woman dressing as one. Their romance progressed to the point of an engagement, but 2 days before nuptials, someone from Joe's past had come into town and wasn't tight-lipped about his past as Lucy. The men in town erupted into such a fury, swarming together into a mob that planned to bring Joe out into the street, strip off his clothes, and paint him with tar and feather him. This kind of anger and violence towards trans men and women are still seen to this day. Fortunately, Joe's wife-to-be got wind of the plot and told Joe. He left his fiancée and the business he'd built to escape the torture and whatever else this mob had planned. This incident was reported across the nation, sensationalizing the event and not really seeking to understand Joe or the cultural significance of the case. Joe seemed to understand he needed to get far away and managed to find solitude for a while. He attained peace for a few years, but he pops up again in the court records of Meeker County, Minnesota, where he was brought to trial for dressing in men's clothing. The only reference to his accidental detection is somewhat biblical in reference, that there was the aid of original sin. This could be in reference to menstruation, Eve's punishment for eating the apple out of Eden, but it's anyone's guess. Regardless, they found Joe innocent, but still wanted him out of the community so badly that they paid all expenses to send him back to Delaware County. At this point, Joe had made quite a name for himself in local and national lore, making it difficult to find honest work. Unable to find employment, he was forced to go to a poorhouse, where he actually met his future wife, Mary Louise Perry. She was a daughter of a well-to-do family in Massachusetts. So how did her upscale life collide with Joe's, you may wonder? Well, she had run off to elope with a man who had subsequently run off with another woman soon after. Marie, rather than return home, stubbornly decided to chase him down. It's not quite certain what her endgame was when she finally found him. However, in her raging pursuit, her money ran out and she opted to be sent to the poorhouse rather than be sent home to Massachusetts to face her family. When Marie arrived, she was weak and in poor health, and Joe was the one who tended to her. And from that day forward, they were inseparable. They eventually left the poorhouse for the woods, where they lived together for quite some time, occasionally venturing into town where Joe would preach the word of God in exchange for donations. Now, one would think Joe would have a conflicting relationship with God, given that today religion is sometimes used as a tool to discriminate and ostracize the LGBTQ community. For Joe, he actually believed his identity was all part of God's plan. In his own words, writing, "And though some do call me a strange sort of being, I thank God in whom I believe and in whom I trust, and who is my defense, and I can praise him, that he has given me a heart that he will mold and fashion after his holy will." Joe and Marie lived on the outskirts of society. They survived on donations and the land. Their vagrancy was an issue, though, for local authorities. However, it was more Joe's lifestyle that seemed to bother them. Marie and Joe's peace together would be interrupted by the authorities arresting Joe on vagrancy charges, and just Joe. On top of that, officials seemed to fixate on putting Joe in female clothes. However, Joe could be equally as antagonizing, taking off the clothes and wandering around his cell naked, yelling profanities. In this particular case, the law was used to target and discriminate. And despite the fact that Marie and Joe were very well educated, communities perpetually pushed them out to the literal fringes of society. They eventually escaped this poverty and harassment through a fortune that was owed to Joe in the form of a widow's pension. George Slater and Joseph Lobdell were still considered as married, and Joe had fought and died in the Civil War years earlier and left Joe with a healthy sum of money, enough to set Marie and Joe up with a home from which they could keep house and make a living. You can't be arrested on vagrancy charges if you own property. Joe enjoyed maintaining the land, and Marie cooked, and together they made a comfortable home and life that they'd always wanted. And I wish the story ended here, happily ever after. But this is a tale as old as time. A person or group of people who are considered abnormal or unwanted or outcasts of society achieve normalcy or even success, and people who fear or hate them see their success as a threat and find a way to take it. One day, Joe went out hunting and didn't come back. Marie began her search for him in the jails and in the poorhouses, thinking the harassment of their past had begun anew. She continued searching until she finally heard word from Joe's family that he was being declared dead. Obituaries were even published in the New York Times, made his death seem even more real. Even though they were more sensational and misgendered him, there was no body of proof to prove that there was foul play. But as time passed, the likelihood that he was truly gone became ever more real to Marie, so she stopped searching. And it's possible the only person who really mourned his passing was his wife. Only Joe wasn't really dead. Joe's brother had brought him to trial as part of a lunacy hearing to have him committed. And while Marie was looking for him, Joe was being shipped to the Willard Insane Asylum in Ovid, New York, where his mind was prodded by a Dr. P.M. Wise, whose work reveals much of the ideals surrounding sex and gender during the Victorian age. Dr. Wise, in his assessments, seemed less apt to really understand what Joe had to say and more interested in using Joe as a vehicle for his own narrative. In fact, Dr. Wise wrote that he thought Joe was such an abnormality that someone like him would likely not occur again. After Joe's time in Willard, he was transferred to Binghamton Insane Asylum, where he lived out the rest of his life until he passed away on May 28, 1912. He was buried without ceremony, as many people were in places like these. His body was carted up a hill away from the institution, where only the gravediggers were his company, and the only memorial to his life was staked in the ground. A heavy iron marker with a number to mark that he had lived a life true to himself, even if others couldn't understand such a life. I can't help but wonder, if he was born today, would he be able to grow up to be seen as an average Joe? Or if similar aspects of discrimination would have kept him at the fringes of society. It's one of those cases where we have to wonder how close history is to the present. Thank you for joining me to learn more about this piece of history. If you want to learn more about Joseph and his life in his own words and from his family, I highly recommend picking up A Strange Sort of Being by Bambi Lobdell. It contains a full copy of Joseph's memoir, as well as a really thorough research done by Bambi. It's looking like Roberson will be opening up July 1st, knock on wood, so I hope to see you at the museum soon for more history and discussion. But until then, bye for now.